Dawkins really assumes that if there was a God, he couldn't be what philosophers would call a necessary being, a being that exists without the possibility of not existing. But that is the traditional theological Christian concept of God. God isn't a being who, just happens to exist, but could have not existed or could stop existing one day. God just exists, full stop, by his kind of very nature is to exist. It's possible for him to exist, but it's not possible for him to not exist. And so, actually, theologically, the concept of God is of a being that it makes no sense to think that God is complex, is unlikely. Is not one possible arrangement of a whole bunch of independently arrangeable physical bits, like the bits of watch that go to make a watch up. And so, in saying, hey, if there was a God to explain the universe, he'd have to be much more complex than the universe, and so he'd need explaining, and you haven't really explained anything, and so on. He's just begging the question against the possibility that if there was a God, he might be, as Christians have traditionally conceived him to be, a necessary being. And Dawkins he says, well, look, I've got an argument to show that if there were a God, he'd have to be really complex, because what's God meant to do? He's meant to kind of understand everything. He's meant to listen to everybody's prayers. He's listening to your prayers at the same time as listening to your prayer. And that's really complicated, isn't it, to do all those things? But interestingly, in a conversation with the agnostic philosopher Anthony Kenny points out that this is a really bad argument on Dawkins' point. And he gives this concrete illustration. He says, think of the difference between an electric razor and an old-fashioned cutthroat razor. The electric razor is obviously much more complicated in its form and structure than the cutthroat razor, which is really simple. It's just a sharpened bit of metal. But you can really only do very few things with an electric razor. Basically, you can shave with it, or you could, use it as a paperweight or something. The cutthroat razor, although it has a much simpler form and structure than the electric razor, you can use it for a lot more things, a lot more functions. So the cutthroat razor, you could use it as a letter opener, as well as for shaving, or as a paperweight, or for you might be able to use the edge of it to undo screws with, or all sorts of things. So the fact that something achieves lots of different functions or does lots of different things doesn't prove in and of itself that it must be a complex, unlikely arrangement of things. So the fact that God can do loads of different things, as Dawkins argues, doesn't show that God must be a complex arrangement of things. No, God is, in theological terms, a simple being. That doesn't mean, he's not a trinity, or he can't do loads of things, or you can't distinguish, not only is he omnipotent, but also he's omniscient, and so on. But as the Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne points out, God is the simplest kind of personal being that there can be.